you would like. And you should have just got a notification that the meeting is being recorded just for your information. Some participation guidelines. No, sorry. Chat us if you cannot see the sign language interpreter. My name is Caitlin Snyder. I'll be managing the chat and the Q&A today. And also keep your audio off until Q&A. And you can post comments and questions in the chat at any time. And here's just a screenshot. The chat feature is down at the bottom, and then it will open a chat window to the right of your screen, and you can feel free to type in the chat and read others' chats as well. So that is everything I have for now. So Christina and Emma, you can take it away and share your slides.
Great, thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us in this roundtable as we discuss co-creative practices for online writers. I'm Emma Catherine Perry, the Assistant Director of the UGA Writing Center, and I'm joined by past and present consultants at the Writing Center, Christina Lee, Katie Dwyer, and Megan Fontenot.
During this session, we will provide an overview of this roundtable topic. Then the roundtable participants will all introduce themselves and their Writing Center experiences. We will then ask questions to the roundtable participants about their experiences with co-creative practices, and we will pose a few questions to the audience. Lastly, we will receive questions from the audience. Again, thank you for joining us today.
During this roundtable discussion, administrators and consultants from the University of Georgia UGA Writing Center will share their experiences using co-creative practices in online interactions with student writers. Addressing one-with-one conference, workshop, and writing group situations, roundtable participants will reflect on the successes and challenges of implementing techniques that distribute agency and share responsibility for the furtherance of a writing project. We'll discuss these practices in the context of the differentiated manifestations of interdependency that our student writers present in their visits to the UGA Writing Center. Roundtable discussants will address their experiences working with both undergraduate and graduate writers, emphasizing their work with graduate student writers in particular. While our consultants may use similar techniques when engaging with writers at the undergraduate and graduate levels, our experiences working with graduate students provide a compelling example of how interdependence underpins and invigorates the writing reality for students at UGA.
As Writing Center scholars have noted, there is a significant dearth of writing instruction and support for graduate students due to the pervasive assumption that graduate students have already learned to write at the level expected and may accordingly receive little instruction or guidance. The UGA Writing Center, like many other grad-serving writing centers, has become an important resource for graduate-level writers who seek support for high-stakes and highly specialized writing tasks. During the 2020-2021 school year, 60% of graduate students who made an online appointment with the UGA Writing Center scheduled multiple appointments. 16% scheduled more than 10 appointments. These writers develop their projects in collaboration with our consultants over time. This suggests that there are robust and varied interdependencies within these consulting and collaborating efforts. Rather than internalize a sense of academic unreadiness when faced with challenging challenging writing situations, our high-frequency visitors take decisive action to build a system of support.
Our roundtable presentation attends to the complexities of writerly interdependence and the impact this attention has had on our practice. Discussants will reflect on their methods for leveraging strategies like scribing, dialogic brainstorming, or direct correction that transgress the purely non-directive mode of writing tutoring in favor of a flexible approach. This approach adjusts and individuates according to the needs of each student writer and does not depend on the hierarchy of concerns that would, for example, demote sentence level intervention below organization.
Roundtable participants will go on to evaluate these co-creative practices and their attempts not to produce what Andrea Lunsford has described as the kind of homogeneity that squelches diversity, that waters down ideas to the lowest common denominator, that erases rather than values difference. Our roundtable discussion will center on the way the independent-dependent dichotomy is troubled not only by our students' clearly expressed agency in seeking support and building the scaffolding they need to achieve their writing goals, but also by our consultants' engagement practices across a range of online interactions. Our panelists will now introduce themselves and describe their experience with online consultations. So Katie and Megan, the floor is yours.
I can go first. So my name is Katie Dwyer. I am one of the Writing Center consultants. This semester is my second semester working in the Writing Center. Last semester was entirely online, and this semester I also do asynchronous online appointments as well as in-person appointments.
And I'm Megan Fontenot. This is my first semester at the Writing Center, actually, and I do a mixture of both in-person and online. And my online appointments are either synchronous or asynchronous feedback through email appointments.
Great, and I'm Emma Catherine Perry. I'm currently the Assistant Director of the UGA Writing Center. I was a consultant at the UGA Writing Center for 3 years and also part of the writing walk-in service at Cornell University for 2 years and the peer tutoring services offered by the Writing Center at Kenyon College for 3 years. Last year we were all online, and I also was giving asynchronous and synchronous online appointments.
And I am Christina Lee. I have been with the Writing Center for 3 years now. My first year was specializing in science writing consulting with undergraduate and graduate students, both in person and online. And the next 2 years, I specialized with only graduate students through in-person and online until last year, which was fully online in both asynchronous and synchronous appointments. So we'll begin with our first question for the roundtable participants. What is your experience working with graduate students in online appointments? What kinds of writing do they bring in? What kinds of support have they asked you for? And is this similar to or different from the work you do with undergraduate writers?
Yeah, so in my experience, graduate students come in with a vast range of types of writing. They come in with dissertations and cover letters, resumes, articles that they're getting ready to send out. So just a very broad range. It definitely isn't confined to the dissertation, which has been really exciting to see. In my experience, graduate students are very much aware of what they need when they come to the Writing Center, and they are sort of ready to articulate those needs. And that often means that the majority of grad students, at least that I have worked with, schedule asynchronous appointments where they sort of just drop off their paper, ask for very specific feedback, and then sort of move on. Whereas undergraduates, again, in my experience, have been more likely to schedule in-person or synchronous appointments, and they're often sort of less sure about what they're there for, especially if they haven't used the Writing Center very often. they tend to make fewer appointments. And often they sort of have vague needs like, my professor said this was bad, how can I make it good? Or can we work on my grammar? So I think graduate students tend to be a lot more precise and aware of the specific needs that the writing they bring in has.
Yeah, I certainly have a similar experience that graduate students usually will say, can you look at this specific question? I'm hoping that it's cohesive enough. I'm hoping that, you know, my transitions are effective. They have a stronger wish list, I guess. More often, I see graduate writing that's at a later stage of the writing process. I feel like it's very rare that I see a first draft. But that being said, I have had appointments with graduate students who were at the brainstorming process. They had the prompt, and they really just wanted to just kind of have a sounding board to start getting an idea of what to write. So while most of my experience with graduate students has been at that later stage in the writing process, it's certainly not only that.
Emma, would you like to add anything to that?
No, I think that about covers it. Thanks, Megan and Katie. Yeah, we can go ahead on to our next slide, I think. Okay, great. What kinds of co-creative techniques have you used with writers, and which ones seemed particularly effective and why? And were there any co-creative techniques that were not effective? How could you tell, and what would you do differently?
So something that I try to do with more with synchronous or in-person appointments is trying to get students to realize that they do actually know what they're talking about. I feel like very often a complaint is, well, I don't know how to say this. I don't know how to say this and have it sound smart or have it sound like it should in a paper. And so I say to them, okay, well, just explain it to me, just verbally to my face. And then once they do that, I repeat it back to them and say, write that down. That's it. That's all it needs to be. That's sometimes more common with undergraduates. I feel like they sometimes feel like they have to sound more academic or more formal than just kind of their natural way of speech. And so I try and show them that you don't really have to. If you just explain something clearly and in a straightforward manner, that's the most effective way to get it across. So it's sort of a, it's not quite scribing because I'm not doing the writing for them, but I do kind of log what they've said and then repeat it back and have them write it themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I have found a sort of a dialogic brainstorming, as Emma and Christina mentioned earlier, tends to be very effective because often I know in my own experience as a graduate writer, sometimes you've just looked at the same page so often that you can't get past the words that are already there. And so sometimes it's really helpful to just sort of talk through something. So one thing that I like to do and that I've had quite a bit of success with has been having the client sort of put aside their paper and just talk through their argument with me and explain it while I have the paper in front of me. And, you know, there are many times in that process where I say, oh, you said that so clearly, but we're not really getting that here. As a sort of specific example, I worked with a client who was working on an application essay, and it was very short, but he was just really struggling with it and struggling to kind of balance that needing to brag about yourself, but also not sound too full of yourself. And so I just sort of asked him questions about why he wanted to go into the field that he was seeking a graduate degree in, what he felt like he could contribute and the skills that he needed to get there. And it turned out, you know, I wrote these down as he spoke, and it turned out that a large portion of what he actually said wasn't in the essay. And so we were actually able to sort of take a look at it and say, oh, you've made all these really great points, how do you then work those into this essay that you've written? And so having a conversation and sort of setting up the session as a conversation has been incredibly effective in my experience.
I agree. It's interesting too how strategies for replicating that conversational mode in an asynchronous feedback appointment. It's something that's certainly been a challenge for me as a consultant. And particularly, I'm thinking in particular about some of these graduate student works in progress that we've seen coming in, particularly over this last summer, I would say, summer 2021. And maybe it's because these texts have been living online for so long that they started to accumulate these layers of feedback from lots of different sources, from the graduate student's advisor, from peer review, from other consultants in the Writing Center. We're down here in Georgia, so the image that sort of suggested itself to me was like these papers being overtaken by kudzu, by this sort of voracious vine that starts to overtake the text itself. We just had all kinds of different users in different kind of word processing platforms would be signified by different colors of text and different colors of marginal comments. And there was something very kind of like vegetal about it all. And it's interesting to have that conversation taking place asynchronously across folks who, many of whom do not even know about me, may not ever have considered that their feedback would necessarily be shared with the Writing Center. It's a little problematic, I think. But being able to observe not only the feedback that the student was in the process of kind of assimilating into their writing process, but also witnessing the conversations between the writer and their other sources of feedback. Meeting with students multiple times over the course of a project also gives you the chance to engage in sort of a slow motion and asynchronous dialogue with the student. Commenting on the comments themselves has been a method that I've observed. Students sort of talking back to feedback in an asynchronous format. So if my feedback is often oriented around question asking. And so to actually have the student hand in the same document a week later with their response to my question, which is often very clarifying for me as a consultant too, answering the questions about word choice or disciplinary conventions. So it's been interesting to see the way those conversations also take place in an online asynchronous format or modality.
Yeah, and Emma, just kind of building off that, I think as you start to work with these graduate writers, especially more and more often, because they're often working on longer pieces than undergraduates bring in, you do sort of develop that conversation and relationship as it goes on. And, I've only been in our Writing Center for a relatively short time, but I've already had quite a number of repeat clients. And a couple of them have even started leaving me notes at the top of their drafts instead of just sort of dropping them off, where they're like, oh, hey, you did this time and it was super helpful. Like, can you do that again? Or I've sent you this before, but this time I want you to look at such and such. And I think that's a way in a format that seems so removed and distant and, kind of like they're dropping something off at a copy editor. I think having that sort of conversation and building that relationship over time, even though we might never see each other's faces, it's really a fascinating process, and you can really get to know a lot about a person and their writing through that. And I think that's just a really cool example of interdependency in a format where people are not together in the same space, whether physical or digital.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's clear that many of our student writers are, especially these graduate student writers to whom we're referring, are very intentional about incorporating the Writing Center and Writing Center services into their writing process for a wide variety of writing projects. And so it expresses a lot of agency, a lot of foresight, a lot of writerly planning. to be sort of identifying spaces within their own writing where they want to incorporate another perspective or they want to seek feedback, expressive of that kind of complicated interdependence that we're thinking about. I'm curious also, what kind of co-creative techniques have you all tried that are not particularly effective, or what maybe didn't work so well in an appointment?
Like to be able to say that, oh, everything works all the time, but it's less that I guess that there are specific techniques that don't work or that aren't effective, and more just there are techniques that sometimes just don't work with specific students. There are some students who, are just either they're not used to writing conferences. They think that they're going to come in and that I'm going to sit there and fix their paper for them while they, scroll on their phone, or, they're just, I've had students who are very, kind of self-deprecating about their own writing, whether it's completely self-motivated or, they've heard things from professors or something like that. So I guess it's less the techniques and more just kind of understanding that a technique that works really well for, some students, for others, it isn't going to apply because of where they are in, sort of their relation to their own writing. That I can try my sort of reverse scribing technique, but if a student is so stuck in this hole of, no, it doesn't sound good, I don't know what I'm talking about, it doesn't sound good, nothing's going to come out of that. And so those are kind of times you have to sort of take those little baby steps and say, okay, well, explain it to me one word at a time. And, sometimes I've had appointments where we don't really get much done. Very little writing actually happens, but I feel like by the end of the consultation, the student has hopefully a little bit of a more self-confidence in their writing. They have a better idea of where to go. So that's kind of a, looking for the silver lining aspect there.
Yeah, and just to bounce off what Katie was saying, I had a student come in today actually who had her paper printed out. She had a version for herself, a version for me. She had her prompt and she handed me the paper and was like, okay, I'll just let you read this. And I didn't really know what to do. And I was like, oh, wow, okay. Because she was a second language writer. And so she knew she wanted help with grammar. And I was fine with providing that help. But also my writing center trained brain was going, no, it's too directive. I can't do this. And so what I ended up doing was like reading it aloud and we sort of went through it together. And so I tried to sort of implement the co-creative techniques and things like that. But the client clearly had very firm ideas about what she expected when she walked in the door. And, if I had sort of tried to push other techniques, I'm not quite sure how that would have worked out, because she was like, she walked in, she handed me her paper and was like, you can read this now. And so, yeah, I think as Katie was saying, it very much depends on what stage the writing is at, where, the client is at, either in their educational career or just even in the semester sometimes. If someone comes in super stressed out, sometimes they might need us to take the reins a little bit more than they might if they're just totally calm and ready to tackle the day. So I think there's so much that plays into whether or not certain techniques work. And I think it's usually not the technique, it's usually just who needs what at a certain time.
Thank you both. Yeah, I agree. I think it's extremely situational, right? Whether or not these techniques work, and between synchronous and asynchronous appointments as well. And even in my own experiences, some co-creative techniques are wonderful across 90% of synchronous appointments and can fall completely flat when I try to do them asynchronously, and can actually really frustrate writers if they want a certain type of feedback. And here I am prompting with question after question after question that they then have to respond to in an asynchronous manner. So thank you. Yeah. I think there's always a lot to learn, and situations vary greatly when we're trying to use these techniques. For the next question, I would love to talk about what are the risks of using these co-creative practices with student writers, and what are the benefits of using these co-creative practices?
Yeah, I can start with this one. I think there are a lot of both. When I think about risks, one thing I'm thinking about is what Emma brought up just a few minutes ago, is sort of, those asynchronous appointments. And, as Christina just said too, what if this strategy just doesn't work for the client? What if I'm putting all these questions into this document in an effort to be interdependent and non-directive? And what if they get it and sort of open it up and all of their expectations are dashed and they feel like they haven't had any help? And there are a lot of, repercussions that can come from that. They may decide not to use the Writing Center again. They may, get a worse grade on the paper than they expected or wanted to get because they had an idea of the kind of feedback they wanted, and that wasn't what they got. I think there are also a lot of emotional risks. I know, especially early on when I was first starting in the Writing Center, it was really hard for me to manage my own emotions when students came in having a hard time with a paper, and they would show me the really brutal comments that their professors would leave. And then they would show me the prompt, and the prompt was not helpful, or there was no prompt. And I really struggled for a while to manage my own emotions there. Like it was very risky for me because it made me really angry, and I wanted to go knock on those professors' doors and chew them out a little bit, but I couldn't. And I couldn't even, I could support the student and the clients through that, but I also had to be really careful about my reactions to their professor, and sort of monitor the things that I was saying. And it's a lot of emotional weight. It's a lot of emotional labor. And I think the more we become interdependent and the more we sort of connect and build those relationships and, are working together like that, we do become more vulnerable and more open to the struggles that our students are going through, and open to the repercussions of expectations not being met.
Yeah, connected to that, I think that the risks and benefits are very much related in that over the course of these, writing consultations, especially if you're meeting with a student more than once, you're building a relationship with them. And the benefit of that is you build a relationship with them, and you get to know them and their work. You get to understand what helps them the best. You hopefully, help support them creating their own writing support network. So it's not just on you. But the risk of that is this idea of, I guess, I don't want to say dependency, but I guess it can create this idea of like, you're their lucky charm or something, that they need you to, give them advice on every single piece of writing. Or there's always questions of boundaries. I've never really had an issue where I felt like a student overstepped those boundaries, but it is kind of always there, in that in the process of using these co-creative techniques and building these relationships with students, that you're at your job basically. You have to kind of keep that balance between this is me at work and I'm invested in helping you, but there's only so much I can do in terms of what I'm capable of making happen within a consultation. And again, I've never really had an issue with that, but I could see it being something that in the right circumstances could come up.
Yeah, I wonder if those risks are particularly magnified by the onlineness of our asynchronous and synchronous sessions. Whereas in an in-person session, you have physical or sort of environmental cues about the end of a session. You're both looking at the same clock on the wall. The next student comes in for their appointment. You can kind of physically stand up and, say you have to use the restroom. There are so many kind of options to physically in using your proximity and your kind of shared embodiment to set some boundaries. Whereas in online appointments, those boundaries become a little bit, we need to use different strategies to signal them or to enforce them. Knowing that there isn't anybody coming into this into this room to signal the end of this session and the beginning of the next one has made those boundaries maybe seem a little bit more porous. I was interested to hear, Megan, about the student who started writing you a note at the top. I have had that experience too. Students who've met with you a few times in a synchronous or an asynchronous session. That was always really cheering because it did sort of humanize the consultant and make the experience of working on the papers a little bit more, a little bit less transactional, a little bit more interactional. However, that's a trick. And so I think it underlines the importance of sort of, the benefits of using these co-creative practices to maybe define some of those boundaries, even though it also poses a risk of making those boundaries seem more porous than we would actually be comfortable letting them be.
Yeah, and Emma, I love what you said about the sort of digital or online environment affecting those boundaries and those messages, the physical space. I'm thinking specifically about my very first online synchronous appointment. I have a really old laptop. I wasn't near a wall plug at the time, and like 2 minutes into the appointment, my battery just drained all of a sudden. And I lost the appointment. I was freaking out, running around the library, trying to find a plug that I could, not bother the people around me, but also be in a good place to talk to my client. And it was a really stressful experience. And, it all worked out, but it really emphasized to me how precarious the online space of the Writing Center is. Like, so many things can impact that, can get in the way beyond just, not knowing how to use a platform or, not having those sort of physical signals that tell you how a session is going. Maybe someone has a bad camera and you can't really read facial expressions. There's just so much that complicates the online Writing Center environment. And then you add asynchronous appointments to that mix, and suddenly it becomes even more complex because you have to interpret the tone in the text that people are leaving, and like, oh, were they mad at me because I put it this way? Or, how are they going to read this comment that I'm leaving? Do I have enough balance between, positive comments and negative comments so that they know I'm a nice person and not trying to hurt their feelings? There are just so many more elements to the online Writing Center that you just don't have to deal with face-to-face in person. And obviously there are also a host of things that you have to deal with in those face-to-face in-person appointments. But the digital environment is just somehow so much more precarious, I think.
Thank you all. You've made some great points over those questions. I would love to move on to the next one on this slide. Specifically, how are the risks or benefits of these practices different between graduate and undergraduate students?
I think a difference is that between graduate and undergraduate students, you're catching them just at different stages of their academic lives. So something I think I kind of maybe focus on more with undergraduate students is basically making good habits. And I try and, put a lot of the appointments in this sort of context of like, here's something you should try going forward, either at the pre-writing stage or the drafting stage or whatever. And I try to make it like, do this on your own and, do it, for everything without coming, obviously to the Writing Center, but without, having to come to the Writing Center for it. Whereas, graduate students, I don't feel as much, I guess not pressure is the right word, because I still, I feel this urge to obviously do my best and help them with their work, but I don't view them as quite as vulnerable, I guess, as the undergrad students. So I don't feel as much of the sense of where the relationship is going to go with graduate students, if that makes sense, because simply because they're later on in life, they're later on in terms of academic experience and in writing experience versus an undergraduate student.
Yeah, I totally agree, Katie. And I think the big thing is that the stakes are just so different. A graduate student brings in an article and it's like, oh, they have to like eventually get this published for their career to get a job. And sometimes it feels like the stakes are higher for undergraduates. When an undergraduate brings in a paper with, lots of comments all over it from their professor and they're near crying, sitting across the table from you, the stakes feel so much higher than when you open the appointment window and there's a paper waiting for you to look at for the next 45 minutes. There's such a difference to that. But at the same time, the work that graduate students bringing in an academic setting, the stakes are so much higher. Like that dissertation has to be defended. It has to pass for them to get their degree. They have to get those articles submitted. It's public facing, I guess, the work that graduate students tend to bring in. And so they're just completely different stakes, whereas things that undergraduates bring in typically are only going to be read by themselves, their professor, maybe one or two peers. And so there are lots of different pressures in each situation, which affects the risks and benefits. If I don't have a good session with an undergraduate student, yeah, the risks are high and it's going to affect them. But if I have a bad session with a graduate student, those risks are going to look very different. Not least because they have a larger support network that they can go to and they say, oh, I got bad feedback. Let me try another consultant. Let me talk to my advisor. A first-year writing student comes in and you have a bad appointment and they fail their paper. It just looks so different.
What you were saying about the stakes made me think of or seeming higher for undergraduate students. I mean, I remember the first time it was an asynchronous appointment. I open up, the document I'm looking at, and it was a personal statement for medical school. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is intense. This is important. I have to give really, really good comments. This is such high stakes. And now I've read, a million of them. It's still high stakes, obviously, but the initial shock has worn off. But also, yeah, your comment about having a writing network, graduate students, they kind of automatically have more people than just me and their professor looking over their work. They have their advisor, they have their peers, they most likely have some kind of writing support. For undergraduates, I can almost 100% say the people reading it are me and the professor, and that's it. So there is just a different, you fit a different role working with undergraduates versus graduate students. And that, like you said, plays into the stakes for sure, where it might seem higher, but actually is lower, or might seem lower, but is actually higher. But yeah, this understanding that if I get a graduate student's writing and is on a subject I'm not familiar with, I kind of think like someone who is familiar with this will read it, so I get papers about plant cell biology and I think, I'll leave comments and say things like, should I know what this means, or will your reader know what it means? And I know someone who is an expert in that field will read it and I don't have to necessarily account for that side of it.
Yeah, listening to your conversation, I'm thinking about the potential for writing, and particularly for disciplined or kind of field specific writing to constitute writerly identity. And I wonder whether the graduate students with whom we're working are further along on that journey, on that process of constituting themselves as professionals within their field through the writing that they're doing. And because of that increased level of experience with these high stakes and yet very specific writing genres that they're engaging with, they're also, whether or not they'd verbalize it this way or not. And Christine, I know some of our research will address that in the weeks to come. But they're aware of kind of the social nature of writing too, and how relying on different forms of support is not just something that they can do on a remedial level or something that they access or help that they access in a crisis, but rather a consistent part of their writing process and their identity as writers who are writing within a community of other scholars too. Whereas our undergraduate students might be approaching the writing situation feeling very much alone and very isolated, and therefore without the benefit of kind of like a robust sort of interdependent network of support or a sense of social situatedness within their writing, that may be provoking some of the anxiety that we encounter in our online appointments with undergraduate writers. Great, thank you, Christina. And this brings us to the next phase of our roundtable. We'd love to engage with the folks who were able to be here today. Thank you so much for joining us. And we'd like to know from the folks who are, oh, sorry, I'm actually skipping ahead a little bit. I guess one more sort of round of input from our roundtable participants. I know that we've been sort of addressing the theme of interdependence as we're going, but any last thoughts on how your experience working with student writers online lends itself to the conference theme of interdependence?
Emma, I was thinking about something you said as we were chatting about this roundtable earlier this week, and you were talking about how a lot of times there's a sort of question of, oh, well, if graduate writers spend too much time in the Writing Center, are they being dependent on the Writing Center and sort of using it to help them along where they should be seeking independence? And I was thinking too about how that relates to our conversation about the difference between undergraduate and graduate writers, because no one really asks that about undergraduate students. It's kind of sort of expected that first-year writing students will find help at the Writing Center and that it will be good for them. But something that we chatted a little bit about was the fact that, this isn't a form of dependence for these graduate writers. They are using the resources at their disposal. They are creating writing networks and seeing those relationships grow over time and seeing, getting to work through the entirety of a dissertation alongside someone. That's just sort of a beautiful example of interdependence rather than dependence, because people, like you said earlier, people are going to read their writing, whether or not it's us. But we can build really, really powerful relationships with them and work towards interdependence by being a really important part of their writing network.
Yeah, I love that it does seem funny that we talk about writing support groups, we talk about joining writing groups and having this writing network, but if someone says, I go to the Writing Center once a week, you are, maybe not mine, but someone's first reaction would be like, oh, like, can't you write on your own or something? So there's this perception that asking for help on your writing is dependency, when really, no, it's building up your community and your network. As for me, I know that I can't say if working in the Writing Center has made me a better writer, because I haven't done as much writing as I should have in the past year, but I can definitely say it's influenced how I teach. I also teach first-year writing in addition to being in the Writing Center. And I graded my first round of papers a week or two ago, and I definitely had an easier time leaving comments for my students, like telling me it was much easier for me to be able to point out what their issues were, what was keeping their writing from being really effective, and what they should be, trying to work on moving forward. And I think it's because I have had a lot more experience doing that with writing where I'm not in the instructor role. I don't have to think about what kind of grade does this get. I'm just looking at it as a piece of writing. And so that's definitely improved my ability to work with my students on that. And I've had some writing conferences with students, with my students over the semester, and I feel like I've been much more effective than them. And so I think it's definitely made me a better reader, a better grader, and eventually a better writer as well.
Now it's time. Thanks, Christina. Yeah, in the last few minutes that we have here for our roundtable today, we'd love to hear from folks who are able to join us for this session. What has your experience been with using co-creative or co-writing techniques in your centers? And I'm also particularly curious to hear whether you've noticed similar patterns of high numbers of return appointments among graduate students seeking long-term developmental support for writing projects in your centers. We'd love to hear from folks in the chat. Also, feel free to unmute yourself and speak up.
I guess I can share. Everybody's being shy. So I was, yeah, I was interested to hear, I could relate to a lot of the experiences that folks have been sharing. So for my center, we do a lot of asynchronous email feedback, and I think partly because of our student body, non-traditional working folks and all of that. So that works well within their schedule. And we've been doing it for several years. And I think, like Ifo said, primarily the way we try to be co-creative is by asking questions, and I was wondering if anybody was going to have like other, how else do you co-create in asynchronous? So there's there, and we don't have graduate students. So it's a little bit different for us, I guess, but I'm thinking a little bit about, who are the return folks that we have, that we build those relationships with versus the one-time folks. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Robin. It's interesting. Another, I guess I didn't share this earlier. A co-creative technique that I was experimenting with a little bit this summer was like very minimal but direct correction with some students with whom we have or with whom I've been able to build like a long-term relationship. And I read a line in I think a book chapter that Michelle Cox contributed to an anthology that termed occasional direct correction as a gift you can give to a writer, especially with somebody, with whom you have a good rapport and a lot of trust built up there. It backfired on me in a way that was actually really delightful, but one of those slow motion asynchronous conversations. I had actually corrected a word that he had used. He had used the word secular it's an economics oriented dissertation. And the next week I get the same document back, and he had kind of commented on my direct correction. Actually, no, this is correct, and it was true. I looked it up, and it was like the fifth definition of the word secular was this very specific term in economics that meant exactly what he was trying to say. So yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting how those things go. Thank you for sharing your experience, and thank you for your question too.
We also have a comment in the chat from Caitlin. It said, in my center, we do not generally have a high number of graduate return appointments except for ESL students. And I have never tutored on a med school application, so I can only imagine. So that's actually really interesting, not to have a high number of return appointments. We do also experience a lot of ESL students, I would say, in our return appointments, but we also have some great experiences really just across language orientations. So But ESL certainly does make up a large number of those who return appointment, I think for many different reasons, as we've kind of said throughout.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for this wonderful roundtable. I've loved so many things I've heard here today, so thoughtful. As I think most of the people in the panel know, I used to be at UGA myself, so I have had similar experiences working with graduate students there. And in my current center, we're charged only with helping undergrads, but I'm really taking away from this conversation the importance, your points about creating a community of support and how that is something that is expected at the graduate level. And, you know, bringing that idea back to our center and the messaging we give to undergrads as one way to bolster the idea that the Writing Center isn't a place that you should be ashamed to visit, but it's definitely a place that is just part of becoming a professional writer or taking advantage of the resources available for you. So thanks so much.
Yeah, Paula, I love that idea about sort of the shame involved with going to the Writing Center and like how that can impact who goes. Like if you're a graduate student, maybe you don't go for a really long time, even though you would like, you know, other eyes on your paper because, you know, oh, it's like a remedial thing. And I'm a graduate student, therefore I'm a good writer. But, you know, I tell my students all the time, and I probably need to practice it more myself. It always helps to have someone else look at it. Like no matter if they know your topic or not, another set of eyes will see things that you don't. And so I really like the idea of sort of trying to combat the shame or, you know, feelings of insecurity when approaching the Writing Center for both undergraduate and graduate writers.
And I think this is a prime time to really emphasize that idea of the Writing Center as a community, because at least here, like we see so many people just excited to be back in person and physical community with each other. And so, yeah, that's a way to, hopefully we can use that to get people back in our center in person.
Yeah, I know we don't have a ton of time left, but it is interesting to think of the way that a year spent primarily online in the Writing Center, at least in our experience, totally online. I'm sure other folks have, you know, different configurations, but basically all online last year, how that is changing our in-person appointments too. You know, whether it's the expectation, you know, a student who comes into an in-person appointment, as Megan related earlier, essentially wanting an asynchronous appointment. But, you know, having that as an in-person interaction, I'm curious about the level of these kind of layers of feedback that have become visible to us by being online for a year. For me, that's definitely enhanced my awareness of the work that we're doing in the Writing Center as part of a network, as part of a constellation of support for our writers. And it would be interesting to think moving forward how to not only further make visible those networks of support, but also to kind of leverage that awareness to bring people into the Writing Center, whether it's in person or through our continued offerings of online services.
Great. So we are running out of time, I believe, very quickly here. If anyone has any last questions for our panel today, please feel free to ask them now. And thank you all so much for all of the support that you all have shown during this session and for your questions and responses. We really appreciate it.
I have a question. So in our center, the way that our email feedback works is that we have an online form and it goes to our email. And so we have set number of papers coming in. And you know, I book the tutors, you know, I know about how long they're gonna take. But it sounds like for your full situation, the students, do they choose the tutor for their asynchronous feedback? Okay, and so it's just like booking a synchronous, I guess, or, and then I guess I was also wondering, you know, are they yeah, I guess I wanted to hear a little bit more about how they're paired, or I don't know, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk to logistics on this too. We use WC Online, excuse me, as our primary platform, and we have all of our tutors actually write their own bios, and so they can speak to where they're at in their academic programs, what their major is, what kinds of writing they're most comfortable with, whether they have any particular strengths working with different types of writers or writing, whether they have linguistic diversity or a particular aspect of their linguistic heritage that they want to highlight in their bio. That's like a good way to do that. And so that does enable our students to shop around a little bit, availability permitting. We were really totally slammed last year, but we have a little bit more looseness in our schedule now. But so it is the same mechanism when as booking synchronous and asynchronous appointments. They just choose in the process of booking the appointment through WC Online.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, with that, we are about out of time. So, Christina or Emma, whoever's sharing, could you please stop sharing? Thank you. And I just have a couple of last slides to share. So we want to just thank the presenters as well as your panelists for being here today and giving such a great and thorough presentation. So thank you. And also thank you to our interpreters. You did a great job. So what's coming next? Nothing. This is the last session for Thursday. Today's recordings will be posted soon on the website, and sessions pick up again tomorrow at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. If you're interested in volunteering for OWCA, you can serve on our executive board. We have 6 openings and the applications are due October 31st. You can also serve on one of our 6 committees that we have. And in addition, you can visit our website, which I will leave up for just a couple more seconds, to see the volunteer opportunities, including the executive board, and then also on our various committees. So we look forward to having you all involved. The link is in the chat as well, so that is great. Thank you. So have a good night, and we hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thanks so much, y'all. Bye.